The Nile did not roar when it arrived. It never did. It crept in quietly, almost politely, spilling over its banks as it had done for generations beyond counting. To the untrained eye, it looked gentle water gliding over dark soil, turning dust into promise. But every man, woman, and child in Egypt knew the truth. The river never spoke aloud. When the Nile breathed deeply, Egypt lived. When it hesitated, Egypt held its breath. On the eastern edge of the river, fields of wheat stretched toward the horizon, their pale green heads swaying softly in the morning air. The stalks whispered to one another, brushing together like secrets passed between old friends. Farmers moved among them slowly, careful not to break what had taken months to grow. Their feet sank into the damp earth, still cool from the night, still smelling of water and clay and life. Kemwaset stood at the edge of one such field, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes fixed not on the wheat but on the river beyond it. At 42 years of age, his hair had begun to gray at the temples, though his posture remained straight, disciplined, trained by years of duty rather than youth. He wore the simple linen of an official who did not need ornament to announce authority. The weight he carried was invisible, but it pressed upon him constantly. He had been born near this river. As a boy he had learned to read its moods before he learned to read hieroglyphs. He remembered clinging to his mother's robe as the floodwaters crept closer to their home, remembered the fear in her eyes when the water came to higher or not high enough. Even now, decades later, the same quiet fear returned whenever the river behaved differently than expected. This year the Nile was hesitant. No proclamation had been made. No priest had announced disaster. Yet the signs were there for those who knew how to look. The waterline sat just a hand's breadth lower than it should have been by this point in the season. The mud it left behind was fertile. Yes, but thinner, less generous, the kind of generosity that could vanish without warning. Behind Kemwaset, a farmer knelt and pressed the soil between his fingers. He said nothing, but his shoulders sagged slightly, as if he had felt something slip away without knowing what it was. Nearby, children ran barefoot along the edge of the field, laughing, chasing one another, unaware that laughter itself depended on harvests they did not yet understand. Kemwaset turned away from the river and began the long walk back toward the granaries. They rose from the earth like silent guardians, massive structures of sun-baked mud brick, their rounded walls thick and unyielding. From a distance, they looked almost humble, blending into the color of the land, but up close, their scale became unmistakable. These were not buildings meant to impress the gods or intimidate enemies. They were built for one purpose only, to hold life when the world grew uncertain. At the entrance, guards stood motionless, spears grounded, eyes forward. They did not salute. They did not need to. Everyone knew who Kemwaset was. Everyone knew what he protected. Inside, the air was cool and dry, carefully controlled by narrow vents that allowed heat to escape but kept moisture at bay. The scent of grain filled the space, earthy, faintly sweet, comforting in a way few things were. Wheat was more than food here. It was time made tangible. Every kernel represented a day someone would not starve. Scribes sat cross-legged near the walls, wooden pallets balanced on their knees, red pens poised above clay tablets. Numbers were etched carefully, deliberately. There was no room for haste. A single mistake could ripple outward, invisible at first, deadly in time. Kemwaset moved among them quietly, reading over shoulders, checking seals, running his fingers along the stamped clay that marked each storage chamber. Each seal bore the mark of the state, pressed while still wet, hardened by the sun. A broken seal was not merely damaged, it was a wound. He stopped before one chamber and rested his palm against its door. The mud brick was cool beneath his skin. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening not with his ears, but with memory. He remembered the stories his grandfather told in low voices at night. Stories of years when the granaries had been empty, when people traded jewelry for bread, when children stopped crying because crying required energy they no longer had. Those stories were not written in stone. They were carried in whispers, passed carefully so as not to anger the gods or frighten the young. But Kemwaset had never forgotten them. They were the reason he woke before dawn, the reason he trusted numbers more than prayers alone, the reason he believed order was sacred. A scribe cleared his throat softly. "My lord," the man said, eyes lowered, "the first tallies from the southern fields have arrived." Kemwaset accepted the tablet and read slowly. The figures were within expected range, not abundant, but sufficient. For now he handed it back with a nod. "Continue," he said. His voice was calm, steady. It had to be. Fear traveled faster than truth. Outside, the sun climbed higher, warming the land, drawing moisture from the fields. In homes across the region, women ground grain into flour, measuring carefully, saving a handful here, a pinch there. Bread baked in small ovens, the smell drifting through narrow streets. It smelled like safety, like routine, like a promise everyone pretended would never be broken. In the temple nearby, priests poured libations and sang hymns to Hapi, the god of the Nile. Their voices echoed softly against stone, rising like smoke. They asked for balance, for continuity, for the river to remember its duty as they remembered theirs. Yet even the gods, Kamwaset, knew, respected preparation. As evening approached, shadows stretched long across the land. The wheat fields darkened to gold and then to grey. The Nile reflected the fading sky, smooth and unreadable. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal cried out, its call lingering longer than usual. Kamwaset stood once more at the granary doors as they were sealed for the night. Clay was pressed, marks made, records signed. Each action was deliberate, ritualistic, almost prayerful. When the final seal hardened, he exhaled slowly, unaware he had been holding his breath. He did not know yet that some numbers would soon fail to align. He did not know that hunger had already begun its quiet walk toward the edges of the kingdom. He only knew what he had always known, that survival was never guaranteed, only earned. As night settled over Egypt, lamps flickered in homes along the river. Families ate, spoke softly, and lay down to sleep believing tomorrow would come as it always had. The Nile flowed on, silent as ever, revealing nothing. And deep within the granaries the wheat waited, waiting for a future that had not yet decided what it would take. The morning light reached the granaries before it reached the city. It always did. The sun crept over the eastern horizon and touched the rounded walls of mud brick with a soft, amber glow, as if testing their strength before committing to the day. To most people, the granaries were just buildings, quiet, unadorned, almost invisible against the earth. But to those who understood them, they were something else entirely. They were patience made solid. They were memory-given walls. Kamwaset arrived before the first workers, his sandals leaving shallow prints in the packed earth. He paused at the threshold, breathing in the cool morning air. Inside, the wheat slept, stacked and sealed, protected from heat, insects, and time itself. The design was intentional, perfected over generations. The thick walls slowed the sun, the narrow vents guided the wind. Nothing here was accidental. Egypt did not trust survival to chance. As the workers arrived, they moved without urgency but never without purpose. Baskets of grain were carried on, shoulders polished by years of labor. Each step was measured. Each load was counted. There was a quiet dignity in their movements, a shared understanding that carelessness here could echo far beyond the day's work. A dropped basket was not just a mistake, it was a future meal lost to the dust. Scribes took their places along the walls, red pens scratching softly against clay. The sound was steady, almost musical. Numbers flowed from mouth to tablet, from tablet to record, forming a web of accountability that stretched from the fields to the palace. Grain was weighed by volume, not by sight. Scoops were standardized. Measures were checked and rechecked. Even the baskets themselves were inspected for wear. Kamwaset walked among them, offering little instruction. He did not need to. This system had been taught, repeated, refined. Boys entered service young and learned that their handwriting could save lives. Men aged into positions where their eyes alone could detect a false measure. Knowledge passed quietly, without ceremony, like a family heirloom. At the far end of the granary complex, Hori stood watching. He was well dressed, his linen cleaner than most, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested confidence rather than laziness. He smiled easily when spoken to, nodded often, listened more than he talked. If there was a man in Egypt who seemed harmless, it was Hori. That was precisely why he was dangerous. He moved closer to a scribe and glanced at the tablet in the man's hands. The numbers were correct. They always weren't or they weren't. Hori waited for a moment when no one was watching closely, when the rhythm of work dulled attention. Then with a gesture so small it barely existed, he spoke a correction. "Check that again," he said softly. The measure from the southern fields was slightly lower yesterday. The scribe hesitated. He remembered the number. He was certain, but Hori outranked him. Authority weighed heavily in a place where obedience was survival. The scribe adjusted the figure, just a little, and pressed the reed pen into the clay. Kernels poured into storage chambers, forming gentle slopes that caught the light like pale gold sand. When the chambers were full, workers smoothed the surface, removing air pockets, sealing the grain in its own abundance. Doors were closed. Clay seals were pressed. Guards marked the date. The process repeated day after day, so steady that it became invisible. In the city, life continued with comforting regularity. Markets opened at dawn. Old men argued in the shade about matters long settled. From the outside, nothing had changed, but beneath the calm, the system worked tirelessly, always anticipating what might come. Grain was rotated between granaries to prevent spoilage. Older wheat was distributed first. Newer harvests were stored deeper within the complex. Pest traps were checked daily. Cats prowled the corridors, their presence as essential as any official's seal. Kemwasit reviewed reports late into the afternoon, his eyes scanning lines of figures as the sun dipped lower. The numbers told a story, but only if read carefully. He had learned long ago that abundance could lie. Surplus bred complacency. That was when systems failed. One tablet made him pause. He frowned slightly, reading the figures again. The discrepancy was small, almost insignificant, easily dismissed as a rounding error, a miscommunication between field and storehouse. Many officials would have ignored it. Some would not even have noticed. Kemwasit noticed. He set the tablet aside and reached for another, then another. He laid them out before him, comparing tallies from different regions, different days. Slowly a pattern began to form, faint as a shadow at dusk. Grain was present, seals were intact, records were complete, and yet, something felt lighter than it should have been. Across the room, Hori watched him carefully. The overseer's face revealed nothing. He was not a man who reacted quickly. That was his strength and his weakness. Hori told himself there was no danger yet. Doubt required proof, and proof required time. Time was something Hori believed he controlled. As evening fell, the workers departed, their baskets empty, their shoulders sore. Lamps were lit inside the granaries, casting long, flickering shadows along the curved walls. The wheat rested, unaware of the human calculations shaping its fate. Kemwasit walked alone through one of the storage corridors, his footsteps echoing softly. He stopped before a sealed door and ran his fingers along the clay mark. It was unbroken, perfect, too perfect. He thought of the farmers watching the river, of the children laughing at its edge, of bread rising in ovens across the city. All of it depended on honesty, so quiet no one ever praised it. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying dust from the desert. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the Nile flowed on, indifferent to numbers and seals, bound only by nature's own rules. Kemwasit extinguished the lamp and stepped into the night. He did not accuse, he did not confront, not yet. But the system had spoken to him, and systems, once disturbed, never truly returned to silence. The hunger did not arrive all at once. It never did. It came quietly, like a shadow that lengthened so slowly no one noticed until the sun was nearly gone. At first, it was only a feeling, a pause before the second loaf was broken, a longer look at the basket before reaching in. In poorer quarters near the edge of the city, women measured grain twice before grinding it, their fingers lingering as if hoping the wheat might multiply through patience alone. Children still ate, still laughed, but their games ended sooner. Energy, like bread, was becoming something to save. Kemwasit saw it in the reports before he saw it in the streets. Distribution numbers shifted almost imperceptibly, just enough to demand explanation. Emergency reserves had not yet been touched, yet daily allotments were shrinking. The math did not align with the promises written in hardened clay. He spent his nights reading by lamplight, tablets spread around him like pieces of a broken map. Each figure was honest on its own. Together they told a lie. By the time he walked through the poorer districts himself, the lie had begun to breathe. A boy sat on a doorstep, chewing slowly on a crust of bread far smaller than his hands. He did not complain. He had learned early that complaints did not fill stomachs. His mother watched from inside, her face turned away so the child would not see her count the remaining loaves. Kemwasit passed without speaking, his chest tightening in a way no official duty had ever taught him to ignore. At the temple, priests argued in hushed voices. Some insisted the shortage was temporary, a test from the gods meant to strengthen devotion. Others feared that punishment would fall not from the heavens, but from the people if hunger deepened. Rituals increased, offerings multiplied, yet grain, once burned in sacrifice, could not be eaten. The pressure found its way into the granaries. Workers grew tense, quieter. Scribes checked their numbers again and again, afraid not of mistakes, but of what perfection might reveal. Every seal was inspected with a reverence that bordered on desperation. Kemwasit summoned Hori at last. They met in a narrow corridor between storage chambers, the curved walls amplifying every sound. A single lamp burned between them, its flame steady. The air smelled of dust and wheat, and something sharper fear. "You oversee the southern tallies," Kemwasit said, his voice even. He did not accuse, he rarely did, Hori inclined his head. I do. There is less grain than there should be. A pause. Barely a breath. Loss happens, Hori replied. Spillage insects. Human error. All accounted for, Kamweset said. And still, the weight is wrong. Hori smiled faintly, the kind of smile meant to soothe. Numbers can feel heavier than they are. Kamweset stepped closer. Close enough that Hori could see the lines at the corners of his eyes, carved there by years of responsibility rather than age. A single grain does not matter, he said softly, but a system that allows one to vanish will eventually lose thousands. The smile faltered. Outside the granaries, the city shifted, bread prices rose, arguments broke out in markets. A woman fainted waiting in line for her ration, her body giving up before her pride would allow her to leave. Guards were posted near bakeries, not to protect the bread, but to protect the peace. Kamweset returned to his records with renewed urgency. He followed the trail backward, tracing distributions, cross-checking seals, comparing handwriting on tablets separated by months. Patterns emerged that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Someone had been careful. Too careful. Adjustments were always small, always justified, always hidden within expectation. When the evidence was complete, he sat in silence for a long time. Exposing corruption would shake trust. Panic spread faster than hunger. Yet silence would feed the slow theft until the granaries stood empty and no one could say when it had happened. That night, a child cried in the darkness of a cramped home near the riverbank. The sound carried through thin walls, then stopped abruptly, not because the child was fed, but because exhaustion won. Kamweset lay awake, listening to that memory long after the sound itself was gone. At dawn, he acted. Hori was summoned before the council, his tablets laid out, his corrections magnified by comparison. The room was still as the discrepancies were read aloud. No one shouted. There was no need. Truth, when finally uncovered, did not require volume. Hori spoke once, then fell silent. His shoulders sagged as if a weight he had been carrying alone had finally become visible. He did not beg. He did not deny. Perhaps he had believed the system would forgive him. Systems never did. As guards led him away, Kamweset felt no satisfaction. Only a heavy sadness, as though something fragile had been cracked beyond repair. Emergency measures were enacted immediately. Reserves were opened. Rations were recalculated with ruthless precision. No grain was wasted. No loaf given without record. The system bent, but it did not break. Still, the Nile remained low. Weeks passed. The granaries emptied faster now, their contents flowing back into the city in steady, controlled streams. Each distribution felt like a promise being redeemed. Bread returned to tables, thinner than before, but present. Enough. Kamweset stood once more before the storage chambers, counting doors that had been opened, seals broken by necessity rather than betrayal. The wheat was leaving, fulfilling its purpose. That knowledge should have comforted him, yet he knew the truth. If the system had failed even slightly more, if greed had gone unnoticed even a little longer, Egypt would already be starving. As night fell, the wind carried the scent of baked bread across the city. It was weaker than in years past, but it was there. People slept with something in their stomachs, even if it was not much. Kamweset closed his eyes and allowed himself one breath of relief. The famine had not won, but it was not finished either. The end did not announce itself. It arrived the way survival often does, quietly, without ceremony, leaving only the slow realization that something terrible had passed without taking everything with it. The granaries stood thinner now, their chambers no longer swollen with abundance but hollowed into careful restraint. Where once wheat had pressed eagerly against sealed doors, there was now space, measured and deliberate. Every kernel that remained had a name in the records, a purpose in the future. Nothing was left to chance. Nothing could beat. Kamweset walked the length of the complex at dawn, his footsteps echoing softly in corridors that had grown familiar in their emptiness. The air still carried the scent of grain, though fainter now, mixed with dust and sun-warmed clay. It was the smell of endurance, not wealth. Outside the granaries, the city breathed again. Markets reopened without the edge of desperation that had crept into every exchange. Bread was still small, still carefully divided, but it existed. Mothers no longer pretended not to be hungry so their children could eat. Old men returned to their benches in the shade, arguing once more about floods long past instead of meals yet to come. Life did not celebrate, it simply continued. The Nile, as if satisfied with the lesson it had delivered, rose just enough to promise a better season ahead. Not a generous one, not a year of excess, but a year that could heal. The river never apologized, and never needed to. Egypt had learned long ago that survival did not come from demanding mercy, but from preparing for its absence. Records were sealed, then sealed again. Tablets bearing the marks of this difficult season were stored deep within archives few would ever visit. They were not meant to inspire pride. They were meant to instruct. Someday another overseer would read them and recognize the quiet warning written between the lines. Kemwesit returned to the fields where the story had begun. The wheat was shorter now, less vibrant, but alive. He watched farmers work the soil with renewed care, teaching their sons where to step, how to read the land. Knowledge, like grain, was something that had to be passed on before it was needed. He was not praised for what he had done. No monument bore his name. There were no songs written for men who prevented disasters instead of winning wars. And that was as it should be. Glory fed the ego, not the people. At night, as lamps flickered along the riverbank, families slept without the sharp edge of fear pressing against their dreams. Children grew, unaware of how close hunger had come, unaware that their future had been balanced on tablets of clay and the integrity of strangers. This ignorance was the greatest success of all. Years later, new kings would rule. Temples would rise and fall. Names would be carved, erased, and forgotten. But the system would remain. Granaries would be built where rivers ran. Records would be kept. Wheat would be saved, not for celebration, but for uncertainty. Kemweset aged quietly. His hair turned fully gray. His steps slowed. One morning, he walked through the granaries for the last time, his hand resting against a wall warmed by the sun. He felt no sorrow, only completion. The wheat outlived him. Long after his name faded, the bread continued to rise. Long after dynasties crumbled, the lesson endured that civilizations do not survive because they are powerful, but because they remember to care for the days when power means nothing. And somewhere, deep within walls shaped by human foresight, grain waited once more, patient as time itself, holding the future in silence.